Dear viewers across the world, most welcome to my channel NAGA World Conflict Zone. Context: Israel. Israel tails wags US dogs. This is the main subject. Given the asymmetry of power between the two, one would expect the US, which furnishes Israel with 3.8 billion a year in military aid, to set the ground rules for their relations. Yet, in Israel's case, the reverse is true. It is the tail that wags the dog. Since 1980s, the US foreign policy consensus has been that Israel knows best how to preserve its security, and that unequivocal US support, not pressure, would induce it to take the risk necessary for peace. Yet, far from giving the US leverage over Israel or advancing the prospect of peace, the approach has ultimately been detrimental to both countries. Benjamin Netanyahu knows all too well how to influence US politics, particularly when violent conflict erupts. He has long exploited the fact that the US inevitably reiterates Israel's right to self-defense without taking into account Israeli leaders' responsibility for triggering a crisis. US officials, regardless of party affiliations, have tended to shy away from acknowledging Netanyahu's direct role in sabotaging reconciliations between Palestinians and Israelis, disenfranchising Israeli Palestinians, citizens of Israel, and empowering his country's most extremist and xenophobic forces. Clearly, Biden belongs to generations of US officials who cling to the hoary visions of Israel as a shining democracy in a sea of Arab autocracy. They are willfully oblivious to evidence of Israeli authorities' systemic abuses and crimes in the occupied Palestinian territories and within Israel. Biden's stance in the most recent conflict amounted to a green light for Israel to continue its military campaign for as long as it wished. Three times the US blocked UN Security Council statement calling for an immediate ceasefire, leading United Nations diplomats to conclude that Biden administrations wanted to keep that body silent. Moreover, as the violence in Gaza was intensifying, it's emerged that Biden had approved the sales of $735 million in weapons to Israel, raising the red flags for House Democrats who had been calling on the administrations to take a more active role in addressing the root causes of the conflict. Clearly, Biden belongs to the generations of US officials who clings to hoary visions of Israel as a shining democracy in a sea of Arab autocracy. They are willful oblivious to evidence of Israeli atrocities, systemic abuse, and crimes in the occupied Palestinian territories and within Israel. The Israeli human rights group B'Tselem and Human Rights was made a compelling case that Israel is now an apartheid state, not a democracy. Nevertheless, the US political landscape is gradually changing. One of the vanguard of this growing movement is Senator Bernie, senator who commands a significant share of support within the Democratic base. Equally promising, American Jews are increasingly skeptical of Netanyahu. A recent Pew Research Center survey finds that only 34% strongly opposed sanction and punitive measure against Israel, contrary to what the liquid dominated lobby would have America believes. American Jews are not a monolith. Young American Jews, in particular, are highly critical of Israel's colonial and aggressive policies. However, it will probably take a generational shift in US foreign policy circles to bring the pendulum back to the middle on Israel and Palestine. Until then, the tail will continue to wag the dog, ruling out a durable, sustainable, and just peace in the Middle East. So, when tail wags dog, then the own owner will do what? Fawaz A. George is professor of international relations and Middle East politics at the London School of Economics, credited.